seems like AI has kind of bubbled into our consciousness in the last year or so. And the question is, who do you talk to who can give you the best possible perspective? Today I'm talking to Dario Gil, who's the big AI honcho at IBM, and we're going to be talking about the future of AI. And IBM, has been at the center of AI research for decades now. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about that today, but going back to Deep Blue and Watson and all these kinds of, there's sort of no better place to start than with someone who's been at the center of that work for a long time. So that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about this conversation.
I'm just excited about demystifying the technology and remove a lot of the lingo that is associated with this topic and try to bring it to a point where we can have a better understanding of what it is, what it can and cannot do.
I wanted to say before we get started, this is something I said backstage, that I feel very guilty today because you're inarguably one of the most important figures in AI research in the world, and we have taken you away from your job for a morning. It's like if, Oppenheimer's wife in 1944 said, let's go and have a little getaway in the Bahamas. It's that kind of thing. What do you say to your wife? I can't, we have got to work on this thing I can't tell you about. I do interviews for a living. That's what I generate hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of transcripts of interviews, of tape of interviews. It used to be we would send the tapes out to be transcribed. Now they're transcribed in literally 5 seconds. That's like day one trivial case, but multiply that out and extend it into the future, and you start to see how, wow, this makes a lot of ordinary operations a lot more efficient.
Well, I think the first thing is that even though AI as a field has been with us for a long time, since the mid-1950s, at that time, AI was not a very polite word to say, meaning within the scientific community, people didn't use sort of that term. They would have said things like, maybe I do things related to machine learning, right, or statistical techniques in terms of classifiers and so on. But AI had a mixed reputation, right? It had gone through different cycles of hype, and it's also moments of, a lot of negativity towards it because of lack of success. And so I think that would be the first thing. We probably say AI is what is that? Respectable scientists are not working on AI defined as such. And that really changed over the last 15 years only, right? I would say with the advent of deep learning over the last decade is when that re-entered again the lexicon of saying AI, and that was a legitimate thing to work on. So I would say that that's the first thing I think we would have noticed a contrast 20 years ago. For AI, at the heart of it is the ability to build machines and systems that are able to learn and to learn by example. So on the positive side, there's just so much digital knowledge that we have accumulated over the last number of decades that we have this tremendous potential to train these machines to learn from all the past knowledge that humans have accumulated, and then use those machines to help us with productivity, right? To, in some way, to collaborate with us or automate things that we don't want to do, etc.
So at what point in your 20-year tenure at IBM would you say you kind of snapped into present kind of wow mode?
I would say in late 2000s when IBM was working on the Jeopardy project, and just seeing the demonstrations of what could be done in question answering.
It literally, Jeopardy is this crucial moment in the history of
Yeah.
AI.
There had been a long and wonderful history inside IBM on AI. So for example, in terms of these grand challenges, at the very beginning of the field founding, which is this famous Dartmouth conference that actually IBM sponsored to create, there was an IBMer there called Nathaniel Rochester, and there were a few others who, right after that, they started thinking about demonstrations of this field. And for example, they created the first game to play checkers and to demonstrate that you could do machine learning on that. Obviously, we saw later in the 90s, like chess, that was a very famous example of that.
That was Deep Blue.
With Deep Blue,
Yeah.
right? And playing with Kasparov. And then, but I think the moment that was really, those other ones felt like, kind of like brute force, anticipating sort of like moves ahead. But this aspect of dealing with language and question answering felt different. Mm-hmm. And I think for us internally and many others was when a moment of saying like, wow, what are the possibilities here? And then soon after that, connected to the sort of advancements in computing and with deep learning, the last decade has just been an all-out, sort of like front of advancements and that. And I just continue to be more and more impressed. And the last few years have been remarkable too.
My hope is that the good outweighs the bad. My real hope is that the benefits are distributed. So if all of it does is make the wealthiest nations wealthier, that's a good thing, but it doesn't solve, the fundamental problem we have as a world, which is that there's a big gap between haves and have-nots. If AI ends up helping the have-nots more than the haves, then it becomes really interesting. That's actually one thing I really want to talk to Dario about. What is the kind of what's the shape of the impact? Is it widely distributed, or is it concentrated near the top?
The use of AI will be highly democratized, meaning the number of people that have access to its power to make improvements in terms of efficiency and so on will be fairly universal. And that the ones who are able to create AI may be quite concentrated. So if you look at it from the lens of who creates wealth and value over sustained periods of time, particularly say in a context like business, I think just being a user of AI technology is an insufficient strategy. And the reason for that is like, yes, you will get the immediate productivity boost of like just making API calls, and that will be a new baseline for everybody. But you're not accruing value in terms of representing your data inside the AI in a way that gives you a sustainable competitive advantage. So I always try to tell people is don't just be an AI user, be an AI value creator. And I think that will have a lot of consequences in terms of the haves and have-nots, as an example, and that will apply both to institutions and regions and countries, etc. So I think it would be kind of a mistake, right, to just develop strategies that are just about usage. So there's a lot of considerations in terms of equity about the data sets that we accrue, and what problems are we trying to solve. I mean, you mentioned agriculture or healthcare and so on. Yeah. If we only solve problems that are related to marketing, as an example, that will be a less rich world in terms of opportunity than if we incorporate many, many other broader set of problems. Right?
Yeah. What do you think are the biggest impediments to the adoption of AI as you think AI ought to be adopted? I mean, if you look, what are the sticking points that you would?
Look, in the end, I'm going to give a non-technological answer as a first one. Has to do with workflow, right? So even if the technology is very capable, the organizational change inside a company to incorporate into the natural workflow of people on how we work it's a lesson we have learned over the last decade. Is hugely important. So there's a lot of design considerations. There's a lot of how do people want to work, right? How do they work today, and what is the natural entry point for AI? So that's like number one. And then the second one is, for the broad value creation aspect of it is the understanding inside the companies of how you have to curate and create data to combine it with external data such that you can have powerful AI models that actually fit your need. And that aspect of what it takes to actually create and curate the data for this modern AI, it's still a work in progress, right? I think part of the problem that happens very often when I talk to institutions is that they say, AI, yeah, I'm doing it. I've been doing it for a long time. And the reality is that answer can sometimes be a little of a cop-out, right? It's like, I know you were doing machine learning, you were doing some of these things, but actually the latest version of AI, what's happening with foundation models, not only is it very new, it's very hard to do. And honestly, if you haven't been assembling very large teams and spending hundreds of millions of dollars of compute and so on, you're probably not doing it, right? You're doing something else that is in the broad category. And I think the lessons about what it means to make this transition to this new wave is still in early phases of understanding.
That one of the most persistent critiques of academia, but also of many corporate institutions in recent years, has been siloing, right? Different parts of the organization are going off on their own and not speaking to each other. Is a real potential benefit to AI the kind of breaking down, a simple tool for breaking down those kinds of barriers? Is that an elegant way of sort of saying what
I really think, and I was actually just having a conversation with Provost very much on this topic very recently, exactly on that, which is all this appetite, right, to collaborate across disciplines. There's a lot of attempts towards that goal, right? Creating interdisciplinary centers, creating dual degree programs or dual appointment programs. But actually, in a lot of progress in academia, happens by methodology too, right? Like when some methodology gets adopted, I mean, the most famous example of that is the scientific method as an example of that.
Yeah.
But when you have a methodology that gets adopted, it also provides a way to speak to your colleagues across different disciplines. And I think what's happening in AI is linked to that. That within the context of the scientific method, as an example, the methodology about which we do discovery, the role of data, the role of these neural networks, of how we actually find proximity to concepts to one another, is actually fundamentally different than how we've traditionally applied it. So as we see across more professions, people applying this methodology is also going to give some element of common language to each other, right? And in fact, in this very high dimensional representation of information that is present to neural networks, we may find amazing adjacencies or connections of themes and topics in ways that the individual practitioners cannot describe, but yet will be latent in these large-scale neural networks. We are going to suffer a little bit from causality, from the problem of like, hey, what's the root cause of that? Because I think one of the unsatisfying aspects that this methodology will provide is they may give you answers for which they don't give you good reasons for where the answers came from. And then there will be the traditional process of discovery of saying, if that is the answer, what are the reasons? Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to do this sort of hybrid way of understanding the world. But I do think that common layer of AI is a powerful new thing. I would say my favorite movie for AI is Space Odyssey, because it really has shaped so profoundly. In this case, kind of like the bad side of AI, but it has shaped the way we talk about the topic sometimes.
In the writers' strike that just ended in Hollywood, one of the sticking points was how the studios and writers would treat AI-generated content. Mm-hmm. Right? Would writers get credit if their material was somehow the source for but more broadly, did the writers need protections against the use of, I could go on, you know what, you probably were familiar with all of this. Had you been, I don't know whether you were, but had either side called you in for advice during that? Had the writers called you and said, Dario, what should we do about AI? And how should that be reflected in our contract negotiations? What would you have told them?
The way I think about that is that I would divide it into two pieces. First is what's technically possible, right? Mm-hmm. And anticipate scenarios like, what can you do with voice cloning, for example? Now, for example, it is possible. There's been dubbing, right? Like let's just take that topic, right? Around the world, there was all these folks that would dub people in other languages. Well, now you can do these incredible renderings. I mean, I don't know if you've seen them, where you match the lips, is your original voice, but speaking any language that you want, mm-hmm. as an example. So obviously that has a set of implications around that. I mean, just to give an example. So I would say create a taxonomy that describes technical capabilities that we know of today, and applications to the industry and to examples of like, hey, I could film you for 5 minutes and I could generate 2 hours of content of you, and I don't have to, then if you get paid by the hour, obviously I'm not paying you for that other thing. So I would say technological capability, and then map with their expertise consequences of how it changes the way they work, or the way they interact, or the way they negotiate, and so on. So that would be one element of it. And then the other one is like a non-technology related matter, which is an element of almost of distributed justice, is like who deserves what, right? Mm-hmm. And who has the power to get what. And then that's a completely different discussion. That is to say, well, if this is the scenario of what's possible, what do we want, and what are we able to get? And I think that's a different discussion, which is as old as life.
Which one do you do first?
I think it's very helpful to have an understanding of what's possible and how it changes the landscape as part of a broader discussion, right, and a broader negotiation. Because you also have to see the opportunities, because there will be a lot of ground to say, actually, if we can do it in this way, and we can all be that much more efficient in getting this piece of work done or this filming done, but we have a reasonable agreement about how we both sides benefit from it, right? Then that's a win-win for everybody.
This will remind us about how much we like real interaction, and it will improve the nature of our person-to-person interactions by removing the onerous tasks that human beings are not very good at doing and were never meant to do in the first place. So when we were talking about doctors, I think when you go to the doctor and the diagnosis is really quick and easy, and the doctor can spend the rest of their time talking to you about what's really wrong with you, that's a much better interaction. And it's better because not because AI is duplicating what the doctor does, but because AI is doing something completely different. But one of your daughters, you said, is thinking that she wants to be a doctor. But being a doctor in a post-AI world is surely a very different proposition than being a doctor in a pre-AI world. Do you think, have you tried to prepare her for that difference? Have you explained to her what you think will happen to this profession she might enter?
Yeah, I mean, not in incredible amount of detail, but yes, at the level of understanding what is changing, like this lens of the information lens with which you can look at the world and what is possible and what it can do, like what is our role and what is the role of the technology and how that shapes at that level of abstraction for sure, but not at the level of don't be a radiologist, because this is
what we want from you. I was going to say, if you're unhappy with your current job, you could do a podcast called Parenting Tips with Dario, which is just an AI person gives you advice on what your kids should do based on exactly this. Like, should I be a radiologist? Dario, tell me. It seems to me like a really important question.
Yeah.
Let me ask this question I'm joking, but in a more serious way. Surely it would, I don't mean to use your daughter as an example, but let's imagine we're giving advice to someone who wants to enter medicine. A really useful conversation to have is, what are the skills that will be most prized in that profession 15 years from now? And are they different from the skills that are prized now? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think for example, this goes back to how is the scientific method in this context, like the practice of medicine, going to change? I think we will see more changes in how we practice the scientific method and so on as a consequence of what is happening with the world of computing and information, how we represent information, how we represent knowledge, how we extract meaning from knowledge as a method than we have seen in the last 200 years. So therefore, what I would strongly encourage is not about hey, use this tool for doing this or doing that, but in the curriculum itself, in understanding how we do problem solving in the age of data and data representation and so on, that needs to be embedded in the curriculum of everybody, that is, I would say actually quite horizontally, but certainly in the context of medicine and scientists and so on, for sure. And to the extent that that gets ingrained, that will give us a lens that no matter what specialty they go within medicine, they will say, actually, the way I want to be able to tackle improving the quality of care, the way to do that is, in addition to all the elements that we have practiced in the field of medicine, is this new lens. And are we representing the data the right way? Do we have the right tools to be able to represent that knowledge? Am I incorporating that in my own with my own knowledge in a way that gives me better outcomes, right? Do I have the rigor of benchmarking too and quality of the results? So that is what needs to be incorporated.
I really can't assign an essay anymore, can I?
Can I assign an essay?
Yeah. Can I say, write me a research paper and come back to me in 3 weeks? Can I do that anymore?
I think you can.
How do I do that?
I think you can. Look, So there's two questions around that. I think that if one goes and explains in the context, like, why are we here? Why in this class? What is the purpose of this? And one starts with assuming like an element of like decency on people, or people are there like to learn and so on. And you just give a disclaimer. Look, I know that one option you have is like just put the essay question and click go and give an answer. But that is not why we're here, and that is not the intent of what we're trying to do. So first, I would start with the sort of like the norms of intent and decency and appeal to those as step number one. Then we all know that there will be a distribution of use cases that people will like that will come in one ear and come out of the other and do that. And so for a subset of that, I think the technology is going to evolve in such a way that we will have more and more of the ability to discern, right? When that has been AI generated, right, and created. It won't be perfect, right? But there's some elements that you can imagine inputting the essay, and you say, hey, this is likely to be generated right around that. And for example, one way you can do that, just to give you an intuition, you could just have an essay that you write with pencil and paper at the beginning. You get a baseline of what your writing is like, and then later when you generate it, there'll be obvious differences around what kind of writing has been generated one on the other.
Yeah, but you've turned everything you're describing makes sense, but it greatly, in this respect at least, it seems to greatly complicate the life of the teacher. Whereas the other two use cases seem to kind of clarify and simplify the role, right? Suddenly, reaching prospective students sounds like I can do that much more kind of efficiently.
Yeah.
I can bring down administration costs, but the teaching thing is tricky.
Well, until we develop the new norms, right? I mean, I know it's an abuse analogy, but calculators, we dealt with that too, right? And it says, well, calculator, what is the purpose of math? How are we going to do this, and so on. Can
I tell you my dad's calculator story?
Yes, please.
My father was a mathematician, taught mathematics at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And in the 70s, when people started to get pocket calculators, his students demanded that they be able to use them. And he said no, and they took him to the administration, and he lost. So he then changed completely throughout all of his old exams, introduced new exams where there was no calculation. It was all like deep think, figure out the problem on a conceptual level and describe it to me. And they were all students deeply unhappy that he had made their lives much more complicated. But to your point, right. I mean, the result was probably a better education.
Right.
He just removed the element that they could game with their pocket calculators. I suppose it's a version of...
I think it's a version of that.
Yeah.
And so I think they will develop the equivalent of what your father did. And I think people say, you know what, if like these kinds of things, everybody's doing it generically and none of us have any meaning because all you're doing is pressing buttons, and like the intent of this was something, which was to teach you how to write or to think or something, there may be a variant of how we do all of this. I mean, obviously some version of that that has happened is like, okay, we're all going to sit down and doing with pencil and paper and like computers in the classroom. But there'll be other variants of creativity that people will put forth to say, you know what, that's a way to solve that problem too.
I'm really interested in the pace. How quickly does he think we go from here to something, even more dramatic? Are we talking about, when people talk about the AI-driven future, are they talking about 5 years or 10 years or 20 years? That's one question. I'm curious to find out his level of optimism about AI. I mean, there's a band of people who think that it could have really destructive effects and bring all kinds of dangers, and others who point out the kind of positive aspects. How does he balance those two sides of it? That's the other big question I have for him.
I think we're at a significant inflection point that it feels the equivalent of the first browsers when they appear and people imagine the possibilities of the internet, or more experience the internet. Mm-hmm. The internet had been around, right, for quite a few decades. AI has been around for many decades. I think the moment we find ourselves is that people can touch it. Yeah. And they can, before there were AI systems that were like behind the scenes, like your search results or translation systems, but they didn't have the experience of like, this is what it feels like to interact with this thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. I think maybe that analogy of the browser is appropriate because it's all of a sudden it's like, whoa, There's this network of machines and content can be distributed and everybody can self-publish. And there was a moment that we all remember that. And I think that is what the world has experienced over the last 9 months or so on. But fundamentally also what is important is that this moment is where the ease of the number of people that can build and use AI has skyrocketed. So over the last decade, technology firms that had large research teams could build AI that worked really well, honestly. But when you went out into say, hey, can everybody use it? Can a data science team in a bank, go and develop these applications? It was like more complicated. Some could do it, but it was more, the barrier of entry was high. Now it's very different.
What struck me, Dario, throughout our conversation is how much of this revolution is non-technical. As to say, you guys are doing the technical thing here, but the revolution is going to require a whole range of people doing things that have nothing to do with software, that have to do with working out new human arrangements, talking about I keep coming back to the Hollywood strike thing, that you have to have a conversation about our values as creators of movies. How are we going to divide up the credit and that's a conversation about philosophy and
It is, and it's in the grand tradition of why a liberal education is so important in the broadest possible sense, right? Mm-hmm. There's no common conception of the good, right? That is always a contested dialogue that happens within our society, and technology is going to fit in that context too, right? So that's why personally as a philosophy, I'm not a technological determinist, right? Mm. And I don't like when colleagues in my profession, right, start saying like, well, this is the way the technology is going to be, and by consequence, this is how society is going to be. I'm like, that's a highly contested goal, and if you want to enter into the realm of politics or the realm of other ones, go and stand up on a stool and discuss whether that's what society wants. You will find that there's a huge diversity of opinions and perspective, and that's what makes, in a democracy, the richness of our society. And in the end, that is going to be the centerpiece of the conversation. What do we want? Yeah. Who gets what, and so on. And that is actually, I don't think it's anything negative. That's as it should be, because in the end, is anchored of who we want as humans, as friends, families, citizens, and we have many overlapping sets of responsibilities, right? And as a technology creator, my only responsibility is not just as a scientist and a technology creator. I'm also a member of a family, I'm a citizen, and I'm many other things that I care about. And I think that sometimes in the debate of the technological determinists, they start now butting into what is the realm of justice and and society and philosophy and democracy, and that's where they get the most uncomfortable, because it's like, I'm just telling you what's possible, and when there's pushback, it's like, yeah, but now we're talking about how we live and how we work, mm-hmm. and how much I get paid or not paid. So that technology is important. Technology shapes that conversation, but we're going to have the conversation with a different language, as it should be. Yeah. And technologies need to get accustomed to, if they want to participate in that world with the broad consequences, hey, get accustomed to deal with the complexity of that world, of politics, society, institutions, unions, all that stuff. And you can't be like whiny about it. It's like, they're not adopting my technology. That's what it takes to bring technology into the world. One of the challenges that we have in this conversation is that there is a lot of sort of attribution to AI, to actions that are inherently about humans and about institutions.
It's energy. It's adding a huge jolt of electricity to a lot of things that we do. You can put that electricity to use in a dangerous way, or you can use it to, light homes and make cars go.
When AI might be at its best is when we don't even notice that it's there, but it's just making whatever we're interacting with better.